Is there any translation or anything, or just speak freely in English?
You speak English and then we'll subtitles.
Okay.
That's easier.
Because if you want, I mean, I'm actually fluent in Serbian. I didn't tell anybody. I could start doing that now if you like. I didn't want to mention it. It felt awkward.
This was on the camera, right? Cool. So, David, we tried to dig something personal about you, but the only thing we could find, yes, is that you fascinate your students in UK. Did you know it?
Did I fascinate my students?
Yes, in a positive way.
No, I had no idea. They think I'm a freak?
No, they think good things about you, and even professors, your colleagues, told us so.
Really? Wow, you investigated? Now I'm like, all right, what else do you know? Did you go back to my family too?
No. Actually, you fascinate your students, so I guess you're a great teacher. This is why I wanted to start by that. So what do you tell them, actually?
That's so nice. Thank you. Well, I basically look at a lot of published works, and we look at that for elements of craft and for style, and I talk with them about linguistics and the history of the language, like Latin and Old English and Middle English. And then we look at their manuscripts and try to do our best to see how we can improve them. And then we all go out to the varsity, to a bar afterwards, a pub, and we have food and drink. And they're really nice. It's my 8th year there, and every year it's just really nice groups of students. They treat each other really well, and they work hard in trying to look at each other's manuscripts. And they stay in touch afterwards. Like it's been fantastic. Out of everywhere I've taught, these have been the nicest groups of people that have like most cohered. So.
And are you harsh with them? Do you tell them that something is not good?
I am critical for all the pieces. I really say what I think works and doesn't work in every piece. So anything I think's not working, I do mention. But I try to say all of it. Keeping in mind that this is work in progress, that it can be revised. I tell all my students to not have any comments that have a subtext of "you suck," you know, that all the work has to be treated with respect. And I wish the world was like that too. I wish that in book reviews, critics would say what they like or don't like, but you know, respectfully, with keeping in mind what an author's trying to do. Every once in a while, critics try to make a name for themselves by being mean. Like, I know there's this guy on one of Annie Proulx's books, a nonfiction book about building her house out west. He called it home porn with a side of salsa. And she's a great writer. She doesn't deserve crap like that. He was trying to just, you know, make himself famous. So yeah, I wish there was a little more generosity in the critical world for books. But I tell my students things like they're British mostly, so they tend to be very hesitant to sacrifice their families or expose much of their personal stories or their shame. My writing mentor had always told me, write about whatever makes you wake up in the middle of the night and cover your face with shame. So I tell my students to take their families up to the altar and swing the axe and try to get them to write about their families. But it's hard to get Brits to write about their families.
But who else do you think it's easier with to work on the family topic?
Well, I've come from California, and if you meet a Californian, they'll tell you their whole life in 5 minutes. Like, and there's nothing personal really, and we really give too much information. We embarrass other people around the world by sharing too much of our personal stories, too much of our personal lives. So it's not hard for me coming from California to write, you know, whatever about myself or my family.
And now let's go to straight to the legend of a suicide. Why the legend? Actually, you have the legend of a suicide, and then in the book there is a story called Legend of Good Men. Why legend? Why not only story or whatever?
Yeah, the word legend has a particular meaning in this. At first, it just seems to mean like a myth, you know, kind of story. But I was reading Chaucer's Legend of Good Women from 600 years ago, and the word legend there means a legendary or a series of portraits of saints' lives. It's from the hagiographic tradition, writing about saints. So I realized it was a different literary structure, a medieval structure that I could use. to structure a short story, giving a series of portraits of these different men that the boy's mother is dating after his father's death. And so they become suitors for her, but also replacement fathers for him. He's a bit like Telemachus in the Odyssey in that way. So I realized that whole idea of a series of portraits could work for the book. That this is a series of portraits of a suicide, a series of portraits of my father. And the reason I wanted that is that no one in my family could agree on one story about him. We all had different versions because of our guilt and our shame and our anger. We all had different versions. Like my grandmother, she said that he died just because of the pain in his head, that it was a chemical imbalance and just a purely physical problem. In other words, his life decisions, his family, all of that had no effect on his suicide. So that's actually obviously pretty divergent from views I would have of trying to understand his suicide. So the idea in the book is that each piece is written in a different style, and there's also a debate in content. There's a different father that appears in these different stories, and different things happen. He doesn't die in the same way in the different stories. So taken together, that debate in style and content, like in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, is supposed to form a richer debate that better reflects the situation of not really understanding ever. No matter how many years I write about him, I still don't understand the final moment, why he had to do it and pull the trigger, and why not? Like, why couldn't he have stayed? They were impossible questions, and it was the biggest event, his suicide, in my life, and it couldn't really be finished easily in the story, so it needed a debate. And 20 years later, I've written another novel about him, which is all supposed to be framed by stories, and so it's the debate goes on. I think of suicide bereavement as a one-sided conversation. It's just an endless conversation with yourself that can never have a finish to it.
And actually, when you start reading your book, the atmosphere, you're immersed in the very weird atmosphere. Let's put it simple, like weird. And then your horizon of expectation is going slowly. It's rising, and then all of a sudden there is like a big twist, a big surprise. We will not reveal it here, but you're like shocked, and then you go back. And I read somewhere that you wrote this story like in a couple of like in 17 days, and actually you are surprised by what you write. So were you surprised when the twist came?
Yeah, I didn't see. I mean, it's an enormous change, as you say, right in the middle of the book. All your expectations are gone. The story changes completely. And I didn't see it coming until I was halfway through writing the sentence. I actually was in the middle of that sentence before I saw where it would go. Had no idea. And so I was so surprised by it that the next day I planned to go back and delete that and continue with my plan. But reading all those pages, rereading them, it was like seeing them for the first time. Like really they had been written by someone else, because I could see all this pattern leading to that moment. So it's the first time I understood how unconscious writing is, how blind I was, and how much writing is about those unconscious surprises and transformations. So since then, I don't write with any plan or outline. I just find out what will happen on the page for all the novels. And surprisingly, they write from the beginning to the end, and they're all structured, even though I had no plan for that. And they're all published the same as the first draft. I just do line edits, but I don't add a scene or cut a scene or move a scene. So the whole process is pretty amazing to me, that our unconscious mind has so much more structure to it than the conscious ideas we have. And sorry, I can hold this for you. You're holding your arm.
It's okay. So, so is the father in that Sakwan Island story, Jim, is he just a bad guy, or he's like a sad guy?
I would definitely say sad guy. I don't feel that my father was a bad guy in any way. He thought he was a bad guy. He honestly thought he was a piece of shit, like that he was supposed to be a better man, that he was supposed to be Christian and really wasn't, that he was supposed to fulfill various expectations and didn't, and he's really disappointed in himself, and that was part of his suicide. beating himself up and then also feeling self-pity, kind of a dangerous spiral. In the book, a lot of people do feel that he's a bad father, at least, because he ends up not being able to take care of his son because of his despair, because he's spiraling down and he's putting all the blame on his second wife, the boy's stepmother, and obsessed by her, thinking about her, as my dad did in real life. I think that's often the case, that someone in despair will try to focus all of it somewhere, even though it wasn't her fault. His despair and his suicide wasn't her fault. Still, he focused on her. And so because of that, it's like the boy's invisible, like he's not even there. And so the child ends up having to take care of the parent. He's having to take care of his father emotionally, and also as the father gets hurt and such, he's having to take care of him physically. And that all seems wrong, to have a child at risk and danger, having to take care of a parent with the roles reversed. But it's not that he's a bad guy. I don't think that any of the characters in any of my books are bad or crazy. So I'm always a little alarmed to hear that readers think like some character's crazy or that they're bad. Like, the reason I like Greek tragedy so much, and the reason I write it, is that the characters are never enemies. They actually are people who love each other, and they want to help each other as much as they can, but they're going to destroy each other anyway because they're acting unconsciously and out of control. The father here is completely out of control. He doesn't realize the effect he's having on his son.
So his hubris, his hybris. What's the father's hybris and what's the son's hybris, actually?
Yeah, hubris, yeah, I think is arrogance in the face of the gods. And I don't think he had that. The truth about, sometimes we want to valorize or demonize suicide. And we want to say that it's heroic or some kind of intellectual choice about the absurdity of life, or we want to say that it's an extremely selfish act and it hurts all the people around. But actually, I don't think it's either one of those. I think it's just that a life is falling apart, that someone has fallen apart and things are not manageable and they're not able to think straight. And so I don't think there's intention. I don't think you can really ascribe intention to suicide. I think the father is just trying to hold it together and not aware of the effect he's having on those around him, and not aware of where he is in his own story, and not aware of the gods.
And what about the son?
and the son. The son is, of course, blameless in all ways, being based on such a perfect and immortal model. The son loves his father really desperately in the book and is trying. And the problem with being young is that you don't have enough experience to know that bad things end. So the boy thinks that this is never going to end, that they're going to stay on the island and they'll never leave. In fact, they'd probably be leaving really quickly. Probably within another month or two they'd be gone. But unfortunately, in his younger mind, that doesn't seem possible. And so he gets driven to a very desperate point because he can't see that they'll actually leave. In my family, we actually, if you include my stepmother's family, we have 5 suicides and a murder. And 2 of those are teen suicides. And teen suicides are unfortunately really common, really prevalent. And it's partly because as teens have a lot of pressure put on them in school and socially, and feel that their situation is unbearable at some moment, they're not old enough and their brain's not old enough to see that actually everything's going to change and that this isn't going to last. It unfortunately, when you're young, has that impression of being a really lasting thing that you can't see the end of. I think that's a big difference between the younger mind and an older mind.
And I want to read you a citation of Kafka. And this is how I felt about your book. It's a very famous one. I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound or stab us. Wound or stab us. Okay. If the book we are reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? So, what was the last book that stabbed you that much?
There have been quite a few, but it's funny. I often, this is a book I read a couple of years ago. It's not the most recent book, but I often think of it still. It's P.F. Tomese, a Dutch writer, and it's I always have trouble remembering the title. It's like Shadow Child. It's about the death of his infant daughter, which happened in real life. But it's an absolutely beautiful book, and heartbreaking every moment. Like with the dead baby, can I hold the baby? Can I hold it? What's beautiful about it is that it talks about that unbelievable, like impossible to imagine experience of losing something so precious so quickly. But also it's about art. All of it's about writing, about how it is we make meaning in a book. Because as he's trying to make his life have meaning again, trying to get the world to start again after this tremendous loss, he's also trying to do that in the language of the book, like trying to get things started again. So that's the last one that really got me, that's still like when I think about it. And it's so strange, I can never remember his title very well, but I think it's Shadow Child. But it's Payoff Tomese, anyway. And it's only like 99 pages, but an absolute heartbreaker. Like, I challenge you to keep dry eyes in that book.
And the last question, what kind of reader you are?
I'm lazy. Those 1,000-page books, I just have a really hard time confronting. I tend to go for the shorter ones. No, I'm really, I read for style. I realized that with a few exceptions, like the book that I just mentioned, where I really feel affected, most of the time I don't care about the characters or what happens at all. I'm really just looking at the sentences. And I guess that's the problem with being a writer. I'm just interested in style, in what other writers can do with their sentences, especially writers writing in English. And so I love Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian and Annie Proulx's writing, Marilyn Robinson, and I read a fair number of poets also. And yeah, in the UK, like young writers like Ross Raisin had a really interesting style, and his first book that was out. So those are always the ones who capture my attention. And now reading a dictionary of the Khazars from Pavich here, like I absolutely love the oddity, the extremity of every action that every character does in it, where it's close to myth or fairy tale or magical realism. That's exactly the kind of thing I like, actually.
So which was a good book for you then. Thank you, David, so much.